Hello, Dr. Mike here. This is topic 1 from my CIS-2808 Introduction to Computer Forensics course. So topic 1 we'll be looking at this textbook. Actually, referring to this textbook throughout the course at the time of this recording. It's a 2011 Digital Forensics with Open Source Tools. This matches the course content, labs as such. But we will talk things beyond the textbook too. As we go through the course, we will address where we get that content from, additional content. So anyways, this is topic 1, introduction. And so again, for CIS-2808. So again, what is computer forensics? I think we all know what forensics is. We've watched enough CSI episodes, probably all of us here. And actually talk about the CSI effect later in the course, but it's both good and bad. But in basics, though, it's the process of identifying, preserving, analyzing, and presenting digital evidence in a manner that is acceptable in a legal proceedings. That's pretty important there. So the book itself, I'm not going to refer too much to the book. It has sort of the same thing here. It really refers to it as scientifically derived and proven methods towards preserving, collecting, and validation, identification, analysis, interpretation, documentation, and presentation of digital evidence from digital sources. So pretty important. Now, when we go through this course, we'll talk about there is some times when digital forensics and physical forensics actually will sort of cross paths several times. But really, we're going to focus on the digital part. But the collection, validation, identification, analysis, interpretation, and documentation, all that stuff, presentation, it really applies to evidence on both sides of the house. So, but the goals themselves here is acquisition, analysis, and presentation. Now that's a pretty high-level look at least from the book, and this is from chapter 1, about the process itself. So, but again, identification of evidence, preserving evidence, processing and interpretation, and ensuring admissibility. This is a pretty good slide. Again, it really summarizes what the book talks about, but there's some stuff here that really is not shown, and we will introduce some of these things throughout the course, but I want to bring them up now. First off, really is search authority. Again, this is coming from more of a legal aspect, and we're going to talk about legal both for criminal justice and really for corporate and cybersecurity. And forensics plays roles in both of these, very important roles. But before we even identify evidence, search authority is going to be a huge concept where, meaning, what can you properly look at? What is in bounds of the search warrant, for example? And this could play a huge role. If you find evidence that's outside the bounds of a search warrant, it is now inadmissible. And so really, this last step here, ensuring evidence is admissible, really goes also, this step here really comes up earlier before you even identify it. Again, you can identify the best evidence for a criminal case, but if it's outside of the search warrant or subpoena, it is no longer admissible, and it's gone. So a lot of times before you would go on a field, let's say, for field work for digital forensics, knowing the scope of your search warrant or subpoena or so on is very important. So, and then the preservation step here, an important part of that is chain of custody. Well-documented chain of custody. So identification of the evidence itself. From here, you might not just identify mobile devices found on site, laptops, desktops, USB devices, backup devices. Of course, you can imagine, photographic evidence, written documentation, evidence about the device, serial numbers, make, and so on, model numbers, things like that. Also, the state they were in. So identification goes beyond that. Again, so we talk about the state of the item. So you have a desktop that's part of the search warrant. I'm sorry. So it is part of the search warrant. It is part of the evidence. Identification is more than just the desktop model. It's also with CPU, memory, things like that. Serial numbers, what was plugged in? Was it on or off when it was plugged in? So the state it was found. So identification has a lot of documentation around it, and that really falls into the preservation. So I almost will put these as a Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap here. But chain of custody is also very important. So when that actor is documented, part of the preservation itself is chain of custody. And you can imagine that's really it's a log of who's, the process of how it was bagged and tagged, identified, and who took it where, checked it and checked it out. I'm going to come back to that also during the course. Processing and interpretation. A very important step here, we're going to come to this during the course, is imaging and hashing. We're going to talk about imaging and hashing a lot, so I'll bring it up now, maybe a little early, even for this chapter, but I like to bring it up now, but this is an important topic we should probably talk about. Imaging and hashing. So first off, what is imaging? So we intercepted our evidence here. Again, I'll just draw a disk drive here the best I can. We have a laptop. That's part of search seizure. It's been identified, state it was in, and so on, model number, what was plugged into, everything about it. So this main laptop, of course, has identified as one single drive. And I'll do the old spinning disk, even though really SSDs are more prevalent now. But in any case, it has one hard drive. So this can be really the main part of our evidence. Drive can be removed sometimes, and it can be bagged and tagged, but the imaging of it. So first off, what does that mean? And this is, again, these are rules I'm going to come back and talk about plain times of the course. So first rule is you never ever investigate on the original drive, original image. So what we do is we make called a hash of it. So and when we talk about hashing later, hashing is really just it's a cryptography step really that is used to create a unique signature. So think of hash as a signature. Anything changes in there, the hash changes. And you may have encountered hashes in a lot of other places too, but this is hashed, and then we make an image of it. So we have a read-only chain, and this could be an actual physical box. It does not allow any write-backs. And we create a copy of this, or multiple copies of this device. And then we hash this one. And these hashes should equal each other. If they do, we have a forensic copy of that. This copy is what is used, you dig into, look at the files, access date times, you extract images, deleted files, all the stuff we're going to go through the course is done on a forensic copy of the original device drive. It could be a drive, it could be a USB device, it could be a phone. So this imaging and hashing, put it out here, this is the imaging process, and this is the hashing process. I even go as far as say, a lot of times you will actually have a blank drive here, and it will have a hash of a zeroed out drive. So it actually is a hash for a drive that's been completely wiped out. You'll hash it to verify it's zeroed out, then make the copy, and then check its hash against the hash of the original. So again, and there's read-only buses, and we'll talk about those, we'll look at those later in the course. There are software ways to do it too, but a lot of times hardware is the best. You want a hardware block that actually just blocks those pins from actually writing back to this device, that drive. So imaging and hashing, this is part of preserving evidence as well as identification. So this really falls into both. Hashing is part of the identification. So in here you'll imagine you have, there's the serial numbers of the device, of the drive, model number, the capacity, maker, and all that stuff is documented. So we keep a log of that. And that log, of course, we also have bag and tag of evidence and chain of custody. So up in another path there. So that's a pretty important part, is imaging and hashing. Very, very important part. I know it's early, and this chapter actually in the textbook might even talk about this, but I do want to bring it up now. is a pretty important concept. So part of that too is this other stuff we talk about here, and that's when we look at process interpretation. First off, the tools we use to look at this drive, again, our image, our copy, our forensics copy. Tons of tools, and that's what this course is about. Really, a lot of the tools, a lot of this textbook itself has a lot of information about the tools. And we're going to focus mainly on open source, really in more of the aspect of how to employ these tools to look for specific evidence. But important part two is validating the tools itself. Our tool sets in our lab, are they checked? Are they validated? I was fortunate enough to spend a few years ago a day at the FBI lab in Cincinnati and ask a lot of questions and see how they do their process. And yes, tool validation is huge. They actually have a different team that will, almost like a QA team, takes the tools in and does monthly checks on them and can validate the tools itself. This is very important because if you're running tools that are out of date, unlicensed, incorrectly licensed tools, anything like that can be used to break the admissibility of the evidence. So if a document was found somewhere in our evidence that could help the case, but yet the tool set and the process was flawed, maybe there was no chain of custody was done incorrectly, all this stuff is going to be under a microscope from defense attorneys, and well, it should be, because evidence that's found needs to be really scientifically proven and shown. And part of this too also is, and this hashing is, let's say we find a document here, we'll create a hash of that document. So this hashing comes in a lot of places, and I'm going to see it used a lot. And we'll talk about how it's done, and we'll create hashes and images through the course. A big part of this, of course, is repeatability, but really important, again, part here is the tool sets to ensure quality. So that's something that's part of really admissibility block here. It's going to sort of fall into that. And this is going to depend upon the size of the lab. It could be just one or two people. It could be an entire team, like the FBI, that has an entire division to help with tools only. So they had a whole workshop of computer scientists that work on algorithm tools, software development. Again, these tools not only are physical; these are software tools. So lab maintaining the lab correctly, things like that. So you can imagine a large-scale operation for forensics to keep all this up and running. So you get this process is solid to ensure admissibility and to ensure proper identification and preservation is a pretty big undertaking. So we'll move on here. So really, again, a big part of this is electronic discovery. That's really a key term here. And it is, as it seems, it is the defining of electronic documents, digital documents, and I say documents, the slices documents. It can be email documents, plain text. A big part here is metadata. This might not be brought up in the slide deck here, and we're going to talk about it later, definitely. There's actually labs for this. Metadata about the document or about the image or the artifact. It's called artifact. And we, of course, the biggest idea here, of course, is photos. We know photos themselves, the photo itself can show us something, but the photo tells us more. Photos tells us when it was taken, especially with our digital devices nowadays, GPS coordinates, what it was taken on, things like that. Even Word documents, there's metadata about the documents, when they were opened, when they were written to, plain text files, spreadsheets. So there's more than just what's in the email. There's information where the email went to, who was sent to, who was copied, the servers it went through, the chain of the servers. So there's a lot of information there that goes outside just the document itself, and that is part of electronic discovery. So let's talk about the sources of some computer cases. And we're going to refer to cases throughout the course. And of course, Department of Justice has a great website for this. You can search on cases and find ones that are applicable and have digital evidence inside of them. So And there's some stuff here we'll look at in the course. Actually, I think there's an assignment where we'll look at that. So it's good to look at previous cases, and we will do this throughout the course and see how it worked. Did the evidence, not only did the evidence maybe find someone guilty, but did it find them not guilty? A lot of part of this process, again, is not, I know we think the analysis part, and we call it the CSI effect. I'll bring this up again probably. The effect that, within a 1 hour show with commercial breaks, you're going to have all the evidence done and said, well, it's a very slow process. Talking with them, a 1 terabyte image could take hours to create. The hashing could take a lot of time to complete. They're very slow processes. So you don't get them right away. And also, it might not be up to, if you are the actual forensic analyst, you're not going to maybe be figuring out who did what. You're just going to find the evidence and present it back to the investigator. Now, there are some things here. If it goes over to the corporate side, cybersecurity side, you might be doing both, playing a role as investigator and forensics, doing forensic analysis there. But, yeah. So it's important to see how digital evidence fits into a case to both find someone not guilty or guilty. So let's keep that in mind. You're not always going to be the one who's going to make that determination. So again, let's talk about that. So the rules around this, and you can imagine law enforcement has more rules, more restrictive, as it should be, because we're dealing with criminal cases, and even civil too. We have to think about civil cases there too. But an important point here is Fourth Amendment, right? The proper search and seizure, things like that. Corporate has less rules to be imagined. You can imagine if you're a corporation and you're part of a cybersecurity team. Most of the time, if you get a job somewhere at a corporation, you sign some document saying anything you do on this corporate laptop, desktop device, it can be monitored and will be stored and for security use. And of course, improper use, you could be fired or somehow be some sort of negative consequence for doing something inappropriate. Like surfing for porn on a corporate laptop, on a corporate network. So no surprise, less restrictive, but also corporate might have a smaller scope, and law enforcement has a larger scope. So law enforcement definitely has a lot more on them to keep things proper. So corporate concerns, detection and prevention, really is what it comes down to. So you still might use the same process. You might still take an image of something. You might, if called for. So example, maybe a web server. You might take a copy of the web server log directory and use that to look for how someone tried to hack us, or how someone hacked our system. You might keep the original intact, just to preserve it, because you might end up hashing through this, or maybe not. You just make a regular copy, right? So all this read-only chain and stuff. If we looked at a corporate cybersecurity forensics investigation, really you might just make a copy. Again, here's our base evidence, and let's say it's a log file, or let's say it's a web server. You might pull the drive and just attach it to a forensics workstation directly and just look at it. Or you might just do a copy. Good old CP, just copy the logs over. No need for the hashing. Because again, there's time here, right? Someone tried to attempted to hack your system. This is the web server. As we know, we're going to see in this course, logs are a huge part of our evidence. The log files from this, a quick copy, just to maybe keep the original intact. And a copy is really quick. And then here I can use some Bash, Python, whatever scripts to look for specific signatures or traces of hacking, and maybe get the IP address from it. Or probably, in my experience, which I've actually done a couple of when I was corporate cybersecurity, really is where to come from, the IP address, and really looking at logs was how or what was the attack? Was it a SQL injection? Again, and if it was, what was the component against? Maybe there's a search field that we forgot about, and the SQL injection actually did kick off in that search field. So in a way, you're sort of reverse engineering the attack. And the idea being, let's go back to our systems, go back to our code base and fix that so it doesn't happen again. Or if someone tried to get in, make sure they can't get any further. If we detect if the hack was being detected and it was blocked by the DevOps team, and maybe we could figure out why. So again, corporate has a different look, but there's something to keep in mind here. Maybe it's not maybe the cybersecurity team is pulled in on a corporate side, and it's not about a hack. Most times, this is what my experience is. This is what you're going to deal with. But still, maybe it's an internal threat. Maybe we suspect an employee has been selling stuff to a competitor. You want to treat these artifacts of evidence as you would if you were on the criminal side. That means bag and tag identification, creating a read-only copy, because you could possibly deliver that to criminal justice, to the criminal side, to maybe to authorities for evidence. So if it's been handled properly from the corporate side, when it does transition over to the criminal side, to criminal justice authorities, the authorities there, and they can show it's been properly handled. That way, there's no way it could be inadmissible in court. So it might depend on the case. So even for corporate, you might find yourself needing to have bag and tag, logging, chain of custody, things like that. And of course, there are some effects. Organizations, HIPAA accountability, Sarbanes-Oxley, GLB Act, things like that. Some of these might actually require you to have certain aspects of forensics work, either in post-incident analysis. Now, law enforcement, of course, we know, I already did the graphic for that. We talked about this already. This is really a properly collected, processed, and preserved. That's pretty important. Really, the law enforcement, as we know, no surprise, law enforcement is about investigation and prosecution. So it's important that evidence is properly handled. So the case priority. Now, this is actually something that's pretty important. So this process that we talked about the hashing and the imaging. We hash an image to create a copy. It is a slow process. So I'm going to sort of go off the slide a little bit. From our work talking with the FBI, they have several cases lined up. So while this has taken 6 hours to create an image of, you will probably sit down and use that time to look at a previous image under investigation. So you might do some tool analysis here and produce some stuff. And then maybe while you're done with that, you might find some time to actually update a report for a different case. So handling multiple things at multiple times here. There's a lot of lanes of traffic going on here. So it's important to be able to sort of have a little bit of planning, I'll call it project planning, just maybe priority planning and notes. One of the biggest things I got from talking with the FBI was a lot of notes are taken, a lot of written notes are taken. And those are stored and maybe even electronically scanned or kept and maybe shared with the team. Because something that you've done here, maybe while you're juggling 4 things at once, something comes up where you need to go and actually present in court for something that happened a year ago. And that is part of definitely part of criminal, is the possibly presenting and reporting and possible extra presentation. So an important thing is, this case you did a year ago, you've done, based on this workflow, you're constantly doing stuff, right? Imaging, stack up a couple things, image, do some analysis, updating a report to go to the investigator, and so on. A year ago, you're like, which case was that? So you need to go back, look at the report that was created, and look at your notes. You might need to present those in court. So presentation is a possibility. And I don't think that's really covered too much in the book. But it is an important aspect. yeah, the book is really focused about the tool sets, which is very important, and we're going to talk about that definitely. But to keep that in mind, notes, detailed notes when you did what you found that can collaborate. That might help you rebuild your presentation. So, all right. So common things here. We talked about corporate already. Of course, we know law enforcement, but also legal professionals, compliance professionals, consultants, maybe for incident response services. So there's a lot of places you'll see forensics used. And all these might have some level, let's say, of authority and that process of ensuring admissibility. Authority and admissibility being law enforcement, right? Search warrants, proper process. Corporate HR professionals might have way less. They can just look at access logs. So yeah, we saw that you did some online gambling from the IT log from your computer when you were logged in. So that's that's a black mark on your record or like that. Or you do it again, you get fired. That type of stuff. Too. Incident response services where it could be a little bit of both. So again, these might come out in civil, insurance, litigations, corporate follow-up, but of course law enforcement and prosecutions, of course, criminal prosecutors will use and hire computer forensic specialists. So law enforcement, this is a pretty important thing here. We're going to transition to a couple of things here to talk about law enforcement and training. So you can imagine there's a lot of tools. We're going to look at a lot of these tools throughout the course. Not all law enforcement understand how the tools are used. More and more the law enforcement understand how to at least properly identify and preserve the evidence and then hand it to somebody to do the analysis for them. But not all law enforcement have, even in forensic shops at all. So training of different levels is very important. And there's resources out there. So a couple big ones here, of course, I'm going to show you is SANS. SANS has the Digital Forensics Incident Response resources here, which are great. This is training that definitely I would recommend to take if you want to look at beyond my classes I teach here. SANS is fantastic. And then for references, NIST has an entire forensic science, which is nist.gov forensics-science. Everything from DNA here, digital evidence. So we get into the digital part. It's good to be able to refer to these for training and information for processes and so on. Both these have some great best practices and references on tools, and we're going to look at that during the course. NIST has a great tool database. Since this course is really tool heavy, you're like, which tool to use for what? And this is where the forensics analysts will have that expertise to understand what's the best tools to use to do the best job during this process of both identifying and collection of evidence. So SANS and NIST are fantastic. And also, the last thing here, which is important, is training. So yeah, we could definitely talk about training, you as a student, or just someone watching this video. Maybe you're an IT professional and you find yourself in cybersecurity. Go learn some forensics, definitely as part of that. But also just end users. So a good example here is with the corporate side. End users, I say end users, you don't have to be talking about, it could be any end user. It could be everyone from the receptionist in the front, security guards, understanding how to identify and identify evidence. Someone who comes onto a scene, security guard for the first responder per se. Learning to just identify, don't unplug stuff, leave stuff as is. Things they might want to bring up to the investigator when they show up, then we'll bring up to forensics analysts. So you can see there, it starts at the very first responders, the frontline person. And even on the corporate side, DevOps, so you're our help desk. So DevOps, level 1 DevOps person. Monitoring system statuses, and looks like they're getting hacked unless they use Amazon Cloud. And don't realize that if you use the cloud services, unless you have it set up properly, the log files that are generated are served in ephemeral disk. And so maybe the processes they use, sort of the step-by-step processes, are old, have never been updated. And step one is to turn off machine. Well, they immediately take that as turn off machine to remove machine. And with cloud, of course, you have several copies listed of these servers. And then unbeknownst, they go into the cloud, and this machine they think is being hacked or has been hacked, and they just get rid of it. Well, turn it off, but they mistakenly turn it off and remove it. And now this log files that are on ephemeral disk are gone. So, and so DevOps realizes that there's a weakness in their process here. So this end users are very important because this first step here, this level 1 DevOps person, unbeknownst, reading this procedure that's outdated, that was really meant for an actual machine that was in-house, right? Where if they turn it off, it's off, but of course the hard drive maintains those log files. Doesn't realize that, yeah, the ephemeral nature of disks and cloud instances, they just lost the log files, which is losing evidence. So that's a case where end user training is very important. And also, you can imagine not just training, but updating procedures and processes too. So these end users come in many forms and fashions, and understand how what they do can affect the preservation of that evidence. It's very important. So again, I talk about that. There's training out there, and this is part of those training goals. Values and culture, baseline for knowledge requirements. Again, this is what I'm so reflected to right here in this graphic here. Best practices. They might be the ones to say, maybe the DevOps person does say, well, you know what? I didn't turn it off. I just removed, I just put it into a sort of standby state and removed the network access or turned off the external network access for it. Because I know that this is ephemeral disk and this policy or procedure here is sort of outdated. It's sort of referring to old school in-house servers. So, this knowledge from our frontline person might be able to actually not just help preserve evidence, but also maybe show where there's some weaknesses in policies and procedures, and they can help make changes. So again, the idea is it does start at the front line. Again, I'm talking about DevOps person. It could be a first responder on scene. Firefighters, paramedics, and that's a tough role there. A paramedic has the utmost duty to preserve life, and so if that means unplugging the power so they can get to the victim, then it means the computer that was on was off. Maybe they can say it was on when they got there, but they had to turn it off. But again, maybe they can communicate that. But again, not everyone's goals is to preserve digital evidence, so let's keep that in mind. Again, training's gonna be tough, and education is important at different levels of education. So, again, not everyone's gonna have full understanding of tools and hashing and different tool use, but at least we'll understand about how to properly preserve and identify evidence. So, other resources again here. There's some stuff that is in the course, digital-evidence.org. There's some basics here about the process. Pretty short read, and then there's this. This is a Spirit of Forensics Discovery. This is also linked in the course. This is an old web page, but it has a pretty nice table here, which I like to bring up. It talks about order volatility. Some we'll talk about again later, but I just want to bring it up again now. It's a pretty interesting thing is, of course, thinking about that preservation step. Of course, there's volatility, right, with digital evidence. Of course, printouts, CD-ROMs, disks, and so on. It says floppies. We have years. Those are gonna be fine, right? But things like registers, peripheral memory, main memory, network states, these are all within milliseconds. So this understanding the order of volatility might approach how you collect evidence. And we'll come back to that later. I thought it was an interesting read. This is part of the additional reading in the course for week 1, topic 1. So that sort of summarizes it. That gives us a quick overview, a little in depth in just the chapter itself. Chapter going to talk about really tools themselves, but there's a couple of things about overview here. And that leads us to the end, and thank you for watching.